The Apache bucked so violently that the canopy frame blurred, and someone on the radio laughed that she was about to auger in because the Sim Princess finally met real weather. But Captain Mara Keane kept the nose pressed into the storm band anyway because Charlie Company had 4 minutes left before the surge and the next enemy push buried them. Operations yelled at her to wave off and return to base so the mishap report would be clean. But the JTAC on the ground was counting down men with ammo, not minutes, which meant obeying now would turn her into a spectator to a slaughter. Her front-seater, Chief Warrant Officer Luis Ortega, shouted that the vertical speed tape was red and the attitude indicator was dancing, so one bad correction would flip them into dynamic rollover and prove every voice predicting she would crash in combat conditions right. The Apache shuddered as a gust hit, the rotor disc biting into ragged air, and the controller's voice cut through again, saying, "Abort. Keane, that's an order," while another pilot snorted that this was what happened when you let a guard sim nerd near a real storm. Mara had half a breath to choose between compliance and men drowning and dying without cover, and because the JTAC had just said 3 minutes until they're in the wire, she pushed the collective instead of climbing out and drove the Apache deeper into the hurricane no Army rotorcraft was supposed to enter. The mockery did not stop just because she stayed quiet. If anything, her silence made the contempt louder, because people with rank always felt safer when the accused did not talk back. The same major who had crashed a hurricane simulator 3 times the day before muttered over the net that someone needed to cut her transmit before she killed herself and embarrassed the regiment, and the fact that he said it on a shared frequency meant every junior pilot listening got permission to treat her as a joke. Mara's jaw locked, but she refused to waste a word defending herself now, because arguing cost oxygen in seconds and the only clock that mattered was the one that ended with Charlie Company blown off the map. She glanced down at the small, non-standard personal recorder velcroed near her knee, its tiny red light still steady while the storm scrambled half the aircraft's certified systems, and she felt a strange, cold comfort that at least one device in the cockpit was seeing what she saw without filtering it. Ortega called out that the company commander on the ground now estimated 2 to 3 minutes before the Levy top was completely compromised and enemy fighters hit their outer positions, which meant that if she backed out now, the history written later would never mention an Apache having a real choice. Mara's left hand shook on the collective from fatigue and buffeting, not fear, so she forced it still and heard herself drop into the same calm checklist cadence everyone mocked in the briefing, because that rhythm gave her brain something solid to hold while the helicopter skated sideways in wind and rain. They were already too deep into the wall of water and noise for the wave-off and go-home option to be truly safe, which changed the flavor of the order she was violating. Turning back now would still mean wrestling the Apache through motorist turbulence, only with no purpose on the other side. Turbulence hammered the fuselage, the rotor tips scything through saturated air that wanted to peel the blades away, and the torque spikes chewed to the margins of what the gearbox liked. But she rode it because the alternative was letting panic take the controls. Every time she tried to stabilize on instruments, wind shear knocked the attitude indicators sideways again. So she leaned into her training, trusting not any single number but the pattern her scan made when it moved fast and disciplined across the panels. The JTAC cut through the static with another update, his voice thinner now as interference built, saying the enemy was forming for one last push and that after this contact there would be no more dry ground to fall back to, which was as clear a deadline as any clock. The Operations Center responded by restating the hurricane doctrine, no Army rotorcraft in sustained hurricane bands under any circumstances, and threatened a formal investigation if she survived, so she found herself in the ugly space where either outcome led to damage. Men lost if she obeyed, a career lost if she did not. She tightened her grip, kept the nose on her improvised waypoint line into the heart of the storm, and accepted that there was no path out of this that left everybody whole. Later, when the board tried to reduce her choice to a checkbox about willful violation, they watched those storm minutes through the cold eye of a recorder. But at the time all they had was a story they already believed about who Captain Mara Keane was. Before the hurricane, she was not the heroic image people liked on unit posters. She was the guard captain loaned in as a simulator expert, useful for teaching theory but, in the minds of the active duty crowd, not built to make real calls under fire. Command's fear of the approaching storm had fused with another fear of a high-profile mishap, So when they pulled her into planning, it was to design scenarios others would beat, not to lead anything. In the dim sim bay, she finally had leverage, so she used it to model the hurricane track as it really looked, not as the optimistic forecast pretended. She built a profile where the outer bands arrived early. Turbulence slammed anything that stayed on the briefed altitude, and comms flickered in and out along the floodplain where Charlie Company Saturday. Major Bryce Harlan, the charismatic pilot everyone admired, strapped into the sim and promised in front of an audience to prove that classroom storms were no match for a real stick, which turned the run into a social test as much as a training event. Because she refused to water down the scenario, his virtual Apache hit violent shear sooner than he expected. He clung to the planned speed and altitude instead of adapting, and the sim showed his aircraft rolling toward the date 3 times in a row. When he tore off the helmet, he blamed her design as unrealistically punishing and joked that this was what happened when you let guard officers who never flew real weather touch the settings, and the room laughed with him, locking in the idea that her storms were the problem, not his assumptions. Mara did not argue. She almost never did in public, because rank and ego love crowds. Instead, she saved the sim logs, marked the timestamps where turbulence and instrument failure hit, and wrote herself a note about how his inputs matched patterns from accident cases. That quiet behavior, recording instead of shouting, was easy to mock as obsessive, but it meant that when reality later traced the same path as her sim, she would have proof that today's impossible profile had simply arrived a day early. The formal storm briefing that followed looked, at first, like the place where hard data might finally matter. Leadership projected the hurricane track, overlaid a neat window where 2 Apaches and a medevac could lift Charlie Company out under elevated but acceptable risk, and stressed that the regiment's mishap-free record would stay spotless. Mara raised her hand once to point out that new satellite updates showed the storm accelerating toward land faster than the CAN model, and that if it bent inland sooner, the ingress route would sit under stronger bands with thinner fuel margins. The colonel thanked her for her academic diligence and promised they would monitor conditions in real time, which sounded reasonable but, in practice, meant no one wanted to move times or redraw routes because that would admit yesterday's plan was wrong. To shield themselves further, the colonel read a rule into the op order and had the staff captain type it in front of everyone. No Army rotorcraft in sustained hurricane bands, period. That doctrine line instantly became more important than any projection. It was the sentence that would later appear on her grounding paperwork and on the top of the board's packet. After the meeting, in a hallway lined with command photos, Bryce clapped her on the shoulder and told her she could sit in his back seat on the mission and see how real pilots handle turbulence without a pause button, which drew an easy laugh from nearby crews. Mara walked away, plugged her small personal recorder into her laptop, and dictated a short entry summarizing the updated track, the fuel and comms risks on the chosen route, and the new doctrine sentence word for word. She printed a stripped-down version for the planning binder and filed the full audio in her private archive, because in a system that worshipped rank, the only way a captain could fight later was to preserve what had really been said. When crew assignments posted, the hierarchy finished the framing. Bryce was flight lead in his Apache. Mara was trail, observe, and learn, with orders to support as directed. On paper, that respected his seniority. In practice, it told everyone which cockpit held authority if reality diverged from a slide deck. She checked the fuel calculations again and saw that even small shifts in storm speed or time on station would chew through the thin reserve, so she underlined the numbers in her notebook and made sure Ortega knew them cold. On the flight line, as she moved through her methodical walk-around, a crew chief joked that she would still be reading checklists when the weather already passed, and a junior pilot mimicked her calm cadence behind her back. Those jabs reinforced the pecking order. Her discipline and caution were proof, in their eyes, that she would always freeze when things went off script. She said nothing, finished the checklist anyway, and, before climbing aboard, tapped the small recorder at her knee to confirm the red light was on, planting one last quiet tool that almost everyone else dismissed as a quirk and that would later become the only continuous record of how their perfect plan met the hurricane. By the time the mission launched, the choice not to change anything had hardened into routine, so everyone could pretend they were flying a normal extraction until physics said otherwise. Departure looked tame enough to soothe nerves, and that surface calm let leadership keep believing in a neat weather window while both Apaches climbed onto the planned route. In trail, Mara ran her checklists in the same calm cadence people mocked, confirmed the thin fuel margins again, tapped the recorder's red light at her knee, and answered Bryce's jokes with short, professional acknowledgments. Once they leveled on course and the base dropped behind them, slides gave way to air that did not care what the op order promised. At first the ingress matched the PowerPoint just enough to lull. Clouds thickened but did not yet slam. Instruments bounced but stayed inside the moderate chop box. And on the radio Bryce sounded relaxed, like a man whose confidence had been rewarded. Mara's sim-train scan, though, saw the edges fraying. Storm returns blooming faster toward their line. Winds already above what the planners had assumed, and a subtle creep in fuel flow as the aircraft fought the headwind. She keyed the interflight frequency and suggested a small dogleg and altitude change to stay ahead of the nastiest cells, arguing that a minor deviation now could save them turbulence and gas later without missing the extraction window. Bryce cut her off, saying if they second-guessed the plan every time a cloud looked ugly they would never get anything done, and that sticking to brief parameters separated professionals from worriers. Because he outranked her and contradicting him on a shared net would mark her as insubordinate before they even saw the objective, she swallowed the rest and replied, "Copy. Lead," binding herself to the track she no longer trusted. That restraint tightened every pressure at once. As they pushed deeper, the storm's outer band arrived earlier than the slides had admitted, and visibility sank from reduced to barely there in minutes. Rain became a solid sheet, the horizon vanished, and turbulence slammed both Apaches hard enough that Bryce's easy tone lost its edge. Mara watched fuel calculations tick downward faster than the plan allowed, because fighting the wind at that altitude and speed burned more than the planning cell had budgeted. She mentioned, more carefully, that dropping or shifting the route could trade a little time for safer air and better reserves. But now, with his authority already challenged by the sky, Bryce snapped that he was not about to let a guard captain talk him into freelancing against a signed order. Ops, listening, backed him by reciting the no hurricane band doctrine, framing any deviation as not just tactical risk but disobedience. When the true outer wall hit, it felt like stepping off a ledge. Instruments fluctuated wildly. The rotor disc bit into inconsistent air, and Bryce's Apache lost stable references faster than any training slide suggested they could. From trail, Mara saw his attitude swing in a way that said he was chasing lagging instruments in a moving air mass. She called that his bank was increasing and suggested leveling, but he told her to fly her own ship and stop coaching from the cheap seats, which shut her up for precious seconds. In that silence, the storm shoved his aircraft into a near-dangerous roll he barely arrested, and the scare jolted him into announcing an abort and immediate return before they lost both birds to a bad idea. Because she had chosen to stay in position and obey up to this point, Mara had no honest way to ignore the Tane without open rebellion on the net, so she matched his heading and fought her own helicopter back through the same fist of air battering his. That compliance took Charlie Company's promised Apache cover off the board just as the Hurricane's core rolled over their position. As the two helicopters clawed away, fuel burn spiked, the distance to the objective grew, and the gap between plan and reality widened into something no one could bridge with words. The JTAC's voice came through thin and ragged, reporting enemy fighters massing again and the levees starting to fall apart, and he asked how far out the Apaches were in a tone that already suspected the answer. Bryce replied that weather had forced them off route and that they were returning to base per directive, effectively telling the men in the mud that the sky had just closed. Ops seized the doctrine shield, ordering both aircraft to RTB immediately and logging the mission as terminated for safety while the levee continued to crumble. Wrestling How Apache through the same turbulence, Mara watched her fuel numbers confirm what her gut already knew. The failed ingress had eaten the thin reserve she had warned about, and the Hurricane now sat squarely between her and the ground unit. Her restraint had protected the chain of command and preserved her image as professional, but it had also helped close off every easy option. By the time Bryce limped onto a safer heading home, The only pilot still in a position to do anything was the one in trail with a mental map of a corridor no one else believed in and just enough fuel left to gamble everything on it. The turn home should have ended the question, but the sound of Charlie Company's JTC trying not to beg made it impossible for Mara to treat the doctrine order as final. As Bryce's damaged Apache clawed toward clearer air, the ground voice cut through again. Enemy at a few hundred meters, Levy failing, wounded stacked behind half cover, maybe one more engagement left before water and bullets finish the job. Ops replied with safe phrases about negative available air assets, talking as if the helicopter she still flew did not exist, because admitting she was an option would mean admitting someone might have to break their own rule. She checked fuel, distance, and time and saw that a clean RTB would land her safe and leave them dead exactly on schedule. Restraint had protected the chain of command. It had not protected the men in the mud. Her first move was a tight half-truth. When the controller demanded fuel state in position, she reported a minor gauge caution and said she needed a short troubleshooting window before committing to a straight homebound leg, which bought her a few minutes of lighter scrutiny. In that slack, she opened the moving map overlay she had built from earlier radar and terrain, saw again the thin storm corridor of slightly less vicious returns, and knew it was the only path still connecting her rotor disk to the company before their clock hit zero. It was the same profile that had wrecked Bryce in the simulator, and the one planners had waved off as too messy, and now it was all that remained. Because her warnings already sat in binders no one would read in time, she understood that if she obeyed, the future report would brand the loss unavoidable and leave doctrine untouched over buried bodies. So she rolled the Apache off the safe heading and nosed into the unauthorized corridor, accepting that from this second on she lived outside the script. Ortega did not argue. He tightened his harness, did quick fuel math, and confirmed they had enough gas for one hard fight and a day to climb out, turning vague fear into a hard ceiling. The storm punished them immediately. Crosswinds hit like fists, vertical drafts yanked the helicopter up and dropped it, and the outside world vanished into a gray sheet, shrinking her universe to instruments and habit. As certified sensors began spitting conflicting numbers, Mara stopped trusting any single reading and leaned on the scan pattern she had drilled alone at night and on the improvised waypoint she had saved earlier, using her checklist cadence to bolt her thoughts to method instead of panic. Charlie Company's transmissions sharpened as she cut deeper into the corridor only she believed in. The JTAC's voice steadied once he realized someone was actually coming and updated her in clipped bursts. Last belts of ammo going into weapons. Enemy forming for a final rush. Levy actively sloughing away. There was no time for a hovering, textbook overwatch. The wind would tear them apart. Instead, she built a rolling attack profile. Brief dips below cloud to line up on muzzle flashes, short bursts from the 30mm, then climbs back into gray before the next gust slammed them sideways. She warned the JTAC to mark friendlies clear, briefed Ortega that firing windows would be seconds long, and then committed to the first run. When they punched through the ragged base and the floodplain snapped into view, it looked like the nightmare version of a simulator graphics. Brown water clawing at sandbags, dark figures pushing across open ground, exhausted soldiers firing from collapsing positions. Mara called, eyes on, rolled into the line her instincts drew, and let Ortega feed range while her cadence did the rest. Short, precise burst of cannon fire chewed through the front rank of the assault and cratered mud at the feet of those behind, scattering them into cover that barely existed. Each pass demanded a fight with the air just to keep the nose on target, and each climb back into cloud reminded her that the helicopter did not care about intentions, only about torque and A-flow. Still, with every run the enemy formations thinned and the levee held a little longer. Fuel did not care about any of it. Numbers slid toward the point where even a straight exit would be tight, and the corridor out would be as ugly as the one in. Because medevac and truck plans had fallen apart, the only way Charlie Company left alive was under rolling air cover while they moved. Mara coordinated with the JTAC to pull squads out in waves, timing their sprints between her attack runs so enemy shooters kept their heads down instead of hunting silhouettes in the rain. Each cycle burned fuel, stretched nerves, and narrowed her own margin for survival. While Ops, seeing from radar that she had turned back into the storm, shouted about gross disobedience and threatened loss of wings if she made it home. Their anger could not change the immediate math of men still in the kill zone. When the last vehicles finally clawed onto slightly higher ground and the company commander reported that all remaining men were moving away from the floodplain, Mara made one more pass to discourage pursuit and then turned toward the outbound heading that might get them home. The fuel state sat in numbers no commander liked to see, and every bump in the storm-weakened A-frame reminded her that the helicopter was as tired as she was. Because she had overridden a written directive and an RTB in front of half the net, the institutional threat that had hovered in the background all day now snapped into focus. Somewhere, an officer was already drafting the opening lines of her investigation. Her unauthorized choice had solved the immediate physics problem and kept the company alive, but it had also triggered setback too. By the system's own definitions, she was now the pilot it had to punish to protect itself. When the Apache finally lurched onto the soaked concrete, the relief of being alive barely had time to register before the institutional weather system closed around Mara. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft to pull data, and a safety colonel met her at the ladder to read that she was grounded pending investigation for willful violation of the hurricane directive and for disregarding an RTB order, reciting regulation numbers in the same flat cadence she used for checklists. Ortega was ordered to surrender any cockpit recordings and report for interview. The crew chief was questioned about whether she had talked about ignoring orders before takeoff. The system's first instinct was clear: treat her as the problem to be contained, not as the person who might have solved one. Mara still did not argue. She unpeeled the small personal recorder from the Velcro by her knee, handed it over, and insisted it be logged with the aircraft data. The colonel tried to dismiss it as non-standard gear, but she calmly noted that the storm had already corrupted certified systems and that any serious board would want every available audio source. He took it with visible reluctance, promising it would be considered, which was bureaucratic, for we did not want this, but now we own it. She was walked to a windowless room while technicians drained the helicopter's electronics and staff officers drafted the narrative they preferred. Dangerous captain. Lucky outcome. Doctrine still right. Somewhere else on base, Charlie Company survivors were still being counted. In this corridor, the main casualty under review was her judgment. Interviews followed, all written from the assumption that breaking the rule had been wrong. Setback 2 arrived as a slow drip. Questions framed to find ego, impulse, or fear of embarrassment at the core of her choice. Mara answered by tying each decision back to earlier constraints: the sim logs, the storm updates, the fuel margins, the levee reports, the doctrine line that had turned retreat into the correct move. Early technical updates made her recorder unavoidable. Parts of the aircraft's digital memory were corrupted by the storm. Bryce's log showed only a messy ingress and abort, and the only continuous audio from start to finish was a device people had mocked as obsessive. When the board finally convened, that red light habit became the center of gravity. The first witnesses leaned into the story the institution wanted. Bryce testified that the weather had deteriorated beyond what any reasonable plan could anticipate, that he had aborted to save both aircraft, and that Mara's reentry into the hurricane had struck him as reckless and unprofessional. Ops officers described how terrifying it had been to see her track bend back into the red and talked about sleepless nights imagining the headlines if she had crashed, framing their fear as proof the directive she broke was wise. For a moment the room's energy pointed toward a simple outcome: strip her wings, file the mission under near miss, and move on. Then they played the recorder. The board heard Bryce mocking the simulator, Ops reciting the doctrine line as if it were a spell, the JTAC counting down minutes and meters, the abort order, and then her quiet negative in everything but words as she turned back toward the company anyway. They heard the levee breaking reports, her steady cadence under fuel warnings and enemy contact calls, the JTAC's voice crack when he realized an Apache had actually arrived through the storm, and the final roll call of squads leaving the floodplain alive. The audio did not make her sound fearless. It made her sound methodical and painfully aware of the cost of every choice. It also made it impossible to pretend her decision had been random. Still, the board needed someone they already trusted to translate that into their own language. Colonel David Rios, the test pilot and accident investigator, did that. After a day with the partial aircraft data, storm archives, sim logs, and full audio, he walked them through the chain. Early warnings ignored. Fuel and route left unchanged. The sim profile matching the real turbulence pattern. The lead aircraft's near loss while staying inside the brief, and the timing of the abort relative to the Levy calls. Then he overlaid fuel, wind, and distance and showed that once Bryce turned back and the Hurricane moved over the objective, the only way any Apache could reach Charlie Company before they were overrun was via a corridor like the one Mara had modeled. Her scan and control inputs, he pointed out, were consistent and disciplined in conditions that would have shredded most pilots. He did not ask them to call her a hero. He asked whether they really intended to punish the only person in the chain who had both understood the physics and acted to mitigate them. In that silence, the story shifted. In procedural language the board respected, she had just been recast from liability to decisive weapon, and the institution, whether it liked it or not, had to see itself as the thing that had tried to stop its own solution. The reframe did not turn the board into fans. It only made it impossible for them to pretend this was a simple misconduct case. Some members still worried aloud about precedent, about captains breaking orders whenever they felt strongly, about headlines if word got out that doctrine had bent under pressure. Others, especially the pilots, could not ignore what the data and the ground commander's testimony made plain. The compromise they reached showed where their loyalties lay. They acknowledged in a restricted report that her actions had directly contributed to saving Charlie Company and that her unauthorized flight path had been flown without mishap, but they paired that with a formal reprimand for violating the Hurricane Directive and an immediate removal from combat flight status. She would receive a downgraded medal mentioning adverse conditions in vague terms at a small ceremony with no media, while the detailed analysis went into a training archive under classification markings. The board protected the rule in public and quietly updated the reality behind it. When they read the decision to her, Mara felt no surge of vindication, only a tired clarity. This was as far as the machine could bend without breaking, and it had bent by carving the cost out of her future. She signed the reprimand and grounding orders, not because she agreed, but because she understood that fighting for more would mean a public war the institution could win simply by outlasting her. Charlie Company sent a framed photo of their people standing on dry ground beside the repaired Levy, signed with a simple thanks for staying. On paper, her career had shrunk. In the quiet circuits of trust, her status had flipped. The same pilots who had laughed about the Sim Princess now lowered their voices when her name came up, and some started dropping by her office with questions about weather models and fuel margins they had once mocked. Her residue cost unfolded in daily absences more than in formal language. She was transferred off the line to a training unit to leverage her experience in complex environments, which sounded like praise and felt like exile. She no longer sat in a live Apache at engine start. Instead, she stood beside younger aviators in simulator cockpits, loading a scenario listed only as Storm Corridor. The profile used anonymized data from the mission, no names, just winds, terrain, fuel, and every student knew it came from something real. When novice lieutenants crashed in the virtual Hurricane, she stopped the run, adjusted their scan patterns, and taught them the same checklist cadence people had once used as a punchline. If any of them asked who had flown the original, she shrugged and said only that someone had refused to leave a company alone. Years later, the memory anchor that remained did not look like a parade. It looked like Mara, older and quieter, watching a young pilot ride simulated turbulence instead of overcorrecting, and nodding once when he made it through. It looked like Charlie Company veterans telling new soldiers, in corners of distant barracks, about the day one helicopter came through a hurricane alone. It looked like certain colonels glancing away when she walked past, remembering a boardroom where their confidence in doctrine had been cut open by a thin folder of facts and a red-lit recorder. She had lost the skies she loved and gained a strange, invisible rank. The person whose story lived wherever people talked honestly about what rules were for. The Hurricane would never appear in her official biography the way it had felt in her bones. But every time a planner widened a weather margin or a young pilot took storm data seriously because someone once proved you could be right and still get burned, the corridor she flew kept doing its work, a narrow path of proof running quietly under the doctrine that tried to deny it.